Good afternoon and welcome to today's social venturing conversation. This is the third of a series of panel discussions around issues often faced by social entrepreneurs. And although we're part of the University of Cambridge, this is very much about real experiences that social entrepreneurs face when they're trying to solve the wicked problems in the world. We know that it's tough to found and run a social venture, but often it's even tougher to think about what happens next. How do social entrepreneurs who often identify closely with their project and are deeply bound up in the mission and the impact that they're trying to have, how do they think about what happens when they move on to the next challenge? That's what we're going to be talking about today. I'm Mark Goodson. I'm head of practice at Cambridge Social Ventures, which is part of the Cambridge Centre for Social Innovation and the Judge Business School. We have with us today three entrepreneurs who've all founded impactful businesses and moved on. We have with us Kath Austin, who's Chief Programme Officer at Form the Future. We've got Alex Ramamurthy, who's Head of Health and Social Care at WageStream. And we've got Loic Menzies, who is an education and youth policy specialist and third sector leader. And what we're going to do is I'm going to ask them firstly to introduce themselves in a bit more detail, perhaps, and talk a bit about their journeys as entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs. So in no particular order, actually in the order people are on my screen. Do you want to tell us a bit about your background and your journey as an entrepreneur and a social entrepreneur?
Sure, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. As Mark said, my name is Kath Austin. I'm currently the Chief Programme Officer at Form the Future, but my background's actually in the third sector, in fundraising for charities. During that time, on the side, I kind of accidentally started a social venture addressing the single-use plastic issue, especially in domestic settings. So I founded BB and Leaf, and we manufactured an alternative to cling film, which was the beeswax wrap, and later the plant-based wrap as well. So I did that for 5 years. It was slightly derailed by a pandemic. And out of that ended up that's the business is still going, as I'm assured, and wax wraps are still being put out into the world. And now I work for another social venture, also alumni of Cambridge Social Ventures and Form the Future, and manage their programmes of encounters for students with employers.
Thanks, Kath. Alex, would you care to introduce yourself?
So yeah, my name's Alex Ramamurthy. I've spent about a decade in social impact businesses and the third sector, mostly around building products and services to support older adults and then those that are caring for older adults. Pick out a couple of examples. I was part of a entrepreneur first startup that built hardware to introduce older adults at home to their doctors and nurses and families through the TV. So it was an early version of telemedicine. I was recruited into the Care Workers charity as chief executive, which is a national charity that supports the UK's 1.6 million care workforce. Charity awards millions of pounds in hardship grants to care workers. During that time, also chaired an incubator called the Care Innovation Hub, which aimed to get more young people and entrepreneurs into the space. And then more recently, I launched my own startup called Murthy, which was focusing on education, fitness, and community for the baby boomer generation. We raised some venture capital funding, and the business was acquired earlier this year. So very much older adults, sort of grandmas and grandpas, and then people that are caring for grandmas and grandpas.
Thanks, Alex. Loic.
Cool. Okay. So yeah, I'm Loic, and yeah, as Mark said, my world is the world of education and youth, and so I've been in this sector most of my life. I started my career as a youth worker and then a teacher, but in 2009, I left teaching and set up what became the Centre for Education and Youth, which we described as a think and action tank. So our job was to kind of bridge between the worlds of policy and practice, and between the wider youth sector and schools. We produced research and evidence to inform both what policymakers did, so that's the kind of think tank bit of it, and practitioners on the ground, people running youth organisations, youth charities, schools and teachers. So basically providing the evidence to ensure that people who are working with children and young people could have bigger impact on their lives and help them to write their own life stories. So I set up that organisation in 2009 and grew the team over the next 12 to 13 years. And then handed over 2 and a bit years ago now. So I am a recovering social entrepreneur and had a brilliant time doing that. But yeah, just can share with you the story of that kind of handover and that transition and build up towards it.
That's great. Thanks, Loic. Thanks, everybody. So I've got some questions for you. First question is an obvious one that people often ask about entrepreneurs, which is, about exits. And did you start your venture with an exit in mind? And if not, when did you decide either to do that or that you would have to do that? So, Kath, do you want to go first?
Sure. Okay. That's a great question. I don't think many entrepreneurs, certainly not me, start out thinking about the exit because it's so exciting. You're fully invested, and for the first 2 years, I think you have this boundless energy, and you just want to put everything into it. For me, it was like my third baby, and so I didn't think about an exit. It was only Cambridge Social Ventures who encouraged me to think along those lines. After the 2-year honeymoon period, I think you do start to think, I'm not sure if I can continue at this pace for that length of time. And I did start to think about the exit. And for us, that was actually going to be passing the business on to employees and employee ownership. And we were partway through that process of handing that over to the employees. And sadly, because of the pandemic, it kind of derailed that process. And in the end, the exit came for me at the time that I needed it as well, in the form of the business being sold on to somebody else and them taking it over, which was kind of sad, but actually for me personally was what was needed.
Alex, what about you? Did you start with an exit in mind? And if so, if not, when did it come into your mind?
Quite early on, yes, because we were quite intentional that we wanted to raise capital. And if we wanted to raise capital, we had to think about a return on investment for those investors. So relatively early on, of course, it's kind of started organically, but then when we looked to raise investment, my co-founder was an actuary and data scientist. And so he was quite clear. We wanted to model out, and actually he did model out up to a Series C. We knew we wanted to go down sort of venture capital route, and so what a typical exit might look like, and then we reverse engineered it to work out at every stage, at every investment round, what would we ideally be looking for and what would we be prepared to give away, which helped over the coming couple of years to dictate terms and to help us with negotiations. So I think the main takeaway there is we were quite intentional when we knew we wanted to take investment, because we had to be clear that they'd be looking for a return on that investment.
Okay, thanks, Alex. And Loic, you worked in your venture for quite a while before you exited. Did you? Was that always part of the plan?
It was to some extent. So I'd say for the first year or so, I didn't know what the organisation was at all, right? I was just doing bits of freelance work in a way that gradually became something. But within a year or two, when I kind of committed to the idea that this was actually going to be an organisation I was going to build and develop, part of what that meant for me as being different to doing just consultancy and so on was that it was an organisation that was more than me. And part for me, the ultimate test of it being more than me was that it didn't depend on me. And that meant that from quite an early stage, I was kind of looking at, I was evaluating the maturity of the organization in relation to the extent to which it could exist without me, and that was brought exit planning into it from quite an early stage. But I knew that I wanted to grow it to a fair bit more before that happened. And then I think I started putting in the foundation bit by bit, which I'm sure we'll talk about later, in terms of moving towards being able to transition. But I did see it as quite a long-term journey going towards that, and it did feel to me very early on that a key part of the organisation's development was my ability to get out.
Building on that, how closely did you identify with your venture, because it actually had your name on the front door, so to speak, to begin with?
Yeah, it did. So it was initially based on it initially was called LK. Well, the first name was LKM Consulting when it was just consultancy, which was my initials. And then then I wanted to move it away from that. So it became LKM Co, but it still had my initials in it. And so part of moving away from the organization was knowing that we would need to rename the organization and change that. So there was this really strong association at an early stage, and because it's quite a public-facing role, being in the world of policy and the media and so on, it was my page on my face on the parliamentary committees or on the media stories and all of that kind of thing. So being able to move away from that was really important, because there was a very strong association between the organisation and me. So managing that was quite tricky.
And what about you, Kath, identifying with the venture? I noticed a lot of the social media around BB and Leaf actually featured you front and centre. So I guess you identify with it pretty closely.
Yeah, so the beginning of BB and Leaf, it was all very much kind of grassroots and me in my kitchen. And then it moved out into much more professional environment. And that did start to lead how we spoke about the business. Saying that though, right up until I handed it all over to the new owner, it was still very much me. And I think that was really quite core to the brand, that people wanted someone to identify with and to relate to. And so handing the exit to hand over to employees was part of that process. And the employees were very vocal. We talked about them as well, and they became part of the identity. And it's a shame it couldn't be passed over to them, because I think they would have carried on that personable theme in the branding, and I think that was important to the product.
And Alex, how about you identifying with the venture?
Yeah, very much so. In the early days, the first sort of 9 months, it was just me. I'd left the care workers charity, and an early version of Murthy was looking at sort of converting underutilized spaces in care homes for older adults for daycare facilities. A little bit like, I guess, an Airbnb for older people. And it was very much built off of the brand that I'd built at the care workers charity and the network that I had. Even the name, so Murthy is what we called the business. And you'll notice my surname is Ramamurthy, except we use Murthy with an I, because mirth with an I kind of denotes joy and happiness. And that's what we wanted to bring to people, and stuck a Y at the end. Whereas mirth with a U, which is how my surname's spelled, is, I believe it stands for like death, which is definitely not what we wanted to bring to people. So we used an I. So it very much was connected to sort of me, my name, and as we grew, and took on funding, went through a bit of a rebrand, it kind of separated from me a little bit, but very much felt like me and my baby.
That's interesting. And Loic, I know that you put an awful lot of planning into the CEO transition. So maybe you could tell us a bit about the planning that was involved to be able to do that.
Sure. So I think there were different stages to it. As I say, part of it was about disentangling the organisation from the kind of association with me. So that was partly about first and foremost about building up the staff team, ensuring that they develop their skills, that they develop their profile, that they their public profile, and that their seniority grew in terms of being able to manage others and lead the organisation. So very much from an early stage involving them in as many kind of strategic sides of the organisation as possible. So I think there's that kind of that human capital element to preparing for transition. And then there was a governance strand. So when I first started out, there was no board. So for me, a huge part of making this transition was making sure there was a board who I felt I trusted to be able to hand over to, and who would kind of safeguard the mission of the organisation and so on. So we converted to a CIC. I set up the board and recruited the best possible people on that, and tried to get that functioning really well with a good chair and so on. So for me, all my confidence in being able to step back comes from my confidence in the board. I think I would find it very difficult to have step back in the way I have if I didn't fully trust the board. So that was crucial. And then there was the more kind of branding and profile side that I mentioned in terms of changing the name and so on. So I think those were probably the three core components in terms of getting the foundations right. Then the initial plan had been that I would announce my departure just when the pandemic hit. So like Kath, events can change things somewhat. At that point, the other foundation was making sure there were enough reserves and enough funding to tide the organisation through. So at that point, it suddenly became a financial question of, is the organisation solid enough to be able to get through the pandemic? And so I immediately at that point realised that this was not the moment to be stepping back, and that I needed to hold the organisation's hand through what was likely to be a tricky period. So I stayed with the organisation during a pandemic, and I then kind of made sure I got the reserves built up again, so that the organisation could weather the next storm, which would be the inevitable turbulence, however much you may have prepared for it, of the founder leaving. And then once I came to kind of announcing to the board and to the team, there was then a lot of careful planning there about, okay, what's my future role going to look like? How are we going to manage the recruitment and so on? So then at that point, it was no longer just me on my own, because it was, I didn't want to let people know that I was going until the right moment. And so that was a kind of, I guess, a more lonely phase of it, with preparation for the announcement. But once it was announced, it then became as an SLT, as an executive team of the organisation, and as a board, we're now going to work on this together. So then I was able to discuss my plans and work those through with them, to talk to other people in the sector who had been in similar situations about how the lessons they'd learned from those transitions, in the same way that we're discussing today. So that was a kind of very different phase of the transition once it became public.
And at the kind of culmination of that, an interesting one must have been selecting a new CEO, which I don't know how much you got involved in that, but as handing your baby over to somebody else and selecting that person.
Yeah, so this was probably one of the most tricky and crucial decisions of the whole process, I think, was about how to do that. And that was one of the places where those conversations with other founders became really important. So I had initially expected to be quite heavily involved. I'd said initially to people, look, I know that normally it's the board's job to pick a successor, a new CEO, but I think I should be involved. And I was dissuaded from that. And so I was speaking to another founder. I think the penny drop moment was when they said, well, if the decision goes wrong, and something goes wrong with the new CEO and it's been your decision, then you're going to feel like you need to deal with that. If it's the board's decision, then it's going to be the responsibility to manage the next CEO, and it should that authority over the CEO should sit with the board and not with you. And that persuaded me. So I didn't feel like I could be completely removed from it. That just felt like a little bit too much. So what happened was that eventually we agreed that I would look at the kind of CV stage and be able to give kind of feedback and thoughts on that to the board. That I would meet with candidates and partly to answer their own questions, because for them I think it's actually quite a big deal stepping into a founder's shoes. But also so that I could then say to a board, not I think this is a strong candidate, I think this is a weak candidate, but to say these are some of the things you might want to talk about in the interview, or you might want to ask about. I noticed that they didn't mention much about this. You might want to ask them about that. So I kind of gave them, but then I delegated that to the board and stepped back, and they made the decision. And in retrospect, I think I'm really glad I made that decision, that we agreed that, because it does mean that I feel it's much easier to let go and wave goodbye to a baby when I know that it's someone else has got responsibility for it.
Really interesting. And Kath, what planning was involved with you and BB and Leaf?
I think I had a team who felt very invested in what we were doing, and they were all very vocal with how they thought the business should be run. We were a very small team, and so the conversations around this were often informal, and out of that came this informal notification that they had a desire to be more involved. And so it was actually their enthusiasm that made me realise that that was the right decision to hand over employee ownership to them, with a plan that I would still stay on board and just reduce the amount of support over a period of time. Yeah, so when it became abundantly clear that's what they wanted to do, we started involving the kind of key personnel much more in day-to-day operations and the strategic planning for where we were going to go with BB and Leaf. So they could show what they would do. They had more of a say, and there was kind of a gradual move over to them taking more seniority. Just like Loic said, we had to be sure that they could take it over, they could run with it and make those kind of critical decisions. And there was one particular person who really just outshone in terms of being able to lead, and he was the operations manager. We never got to the point of actually deciding who would take over as CEO. My gut instinct would be that we would probably have handed it over to him. But I think on reflection, we perhaps should have gone through a process of recruitment, and he would have been part of that. But it was slow. It wasn't perhaps as well structured as Loic's approach to it. But it was, it was helping them to step up into the roles.
And did you, Kath, think about, in terms of employee ownership, the kind of the legal structure aspect of that, whether it might make sense to turn it into a cooperative, or, how that employee ownership would work in terms of share options and things like that? What was the thinking about that at the time?
We did look at that, and it would probably have had to have been a cooperative if we hadn't have had this really interesting mix of people interested in taking ownership. As it happened, we had a couple who were in a relationship and essentially could have carried on that family structure of the business as we had, because it was a family-owned business to start with. And so it made it much simpler for us. We didn't have to think about changing the structure of the organisation. But if it included other employees who were interested, then yes, it would have needed a complete rethink of how it was owned. So I would have gone down the cooperative route.
Okay, that's interesting.
Mark, can I just jump in to say, building on what Kath was saying, I think that there was a point where I had a deputy who I used to think would probably step up and be the next CEO. So I think there is that kind of question of if there's natural succession within the team. She ended up getting another job not long before I was hoping to announce I was going, which was slightly scuppered that plan. So I think the process would have looked slightly different if she stayed. And then at that point, when we were recruiting, obviously there was a question of whether anyone else on the team felt like they would want to step up. And that in the end, no one felt they were ready to. But there was that discussion as well. So yeah, I think that's often a natural way forward.
Thanks, Loic. And Alex, what about your planning process in terms of the handover or exit, however you want to describe it?
Yeah, so as I sort of said at the start, we were quite intentional that we wanted to go down a venture capital route, which kind of dictates the growth trajectory that you need to go on. And so to set the scene in a relatively short amount of time, we built a platform that grew to 50,000 members. I think it was 18 months. We generated around 35,000 reviews with an average rating of 4.7 out of 5 on Trustpilot. So we were the highest rated activities platform for older people. And when we raised the first VC round, which was about £1 million, it was in 2020, and they were very much behind the sort of American view of growth and engagement at all costs, and we'll monetize later. You would just raise loads of money later and we'll monetize it, which was cool because I got to spend lots of money. But then in 2022, it was a very different economic climate. And so when we went back out to raise, and we were close to raising the 3 million Series A, it didn't quite get together because the investor conversations or questions were not about your growth metrics and engagement metrics. It's about what's your monthly recurring revenue, and we didn't have that to show. That wasn't the strategy. The idea was to hit a critical mass, launch other products and services, things around advertising, and then we monetize later. So for us, we at the last hurdle, we weren't able to raise that Series A, and so I was quite clear with myself that we needed to see a certain milestone in order for this to feel like it can continue to grow and follow the trajectory that it needed to. Otherwise, it would feel like VCs and investors were just going to lose interest, and we'd be kind of kicking the can down the proverbial road, as it were. And I know a lot of founders that struggle to let go of their baby, as it were, and 1 year turns into 2, turns into 3. And I really wanted to try and avoid that. So I was quite clear that by, it felt like an age, but it was about 6 months. If we can't raise X and reach sort of Y milestone, that I was going to move at looking at an acquirer. We missed that kind of milestone, came and went. And so I got the board on board with my plans. They were very supportive. And within a space of sort of 2 months, moved to finding a new home for Murthy. And so we were quite clear about who we wanted to speak to. So it was existing partners, existing B2B clients made the most sense, and then sort of competitors, ideally at that startup phase. For example, Saga, you may all know Saga. They were a natural fit, but they were going to take like a year over discussions. So the best opportunity were competitors and more startup phase, because I could have a founder to founder conversation, and actually they can make the decisions really quickly. So for me, the most important thing was finding the right fit for the business, making sure that the team was safe, so they would have an opportunity to move over to the acquirer, that those 50,000 members had a home, because those 35,000 reviews, we really impacted people's lives. They had a community to connect, to learn, to get healthy or keep healthy. So that was really important for me. And then probably at the back was investors get as much capital back as possible. And I'm fortunate that our investors supported that strategy, and that allowed me to hone our targets. And we were lucky enough to we had a few conversations, but Restless Group, who acquired us, were a competitor in the space, fortunately had raised a round very recently. So they had some capital. And I think within about 1 month, we progressed. Every day I was speaking to the founder, and we progressed discussions through to an agreement. Then came all these legal, you have to deal with crap when you raise capital and sign your life away and all sorts of warrants. And I had to do the same with the acquisition, even though bluntly, I was getting nothing out of it because the venture capital investors had preference shares, so they would get all their money out first. I still had to sign my life away again. So that was very stressful, but we made it happen really quickly.
Right. And was there any ongoing commitment from you, Alex, in terms of going onto the board of Restless or staying on as a consultant for a while or anything like that?
Yes, and in hindsight, I should have taken it. They offered a really nice consultancy package, and but I actually went straight to wanting to launch something else. So I joined. I applied for Antler, which is one of these accelerator programs where they invest in you as a founder, help you find a co-founder, and within 12 weeks come up with a business idea that they'll back. And that was starting on Feb the 1st. So the acquisition happened on Jan the 1st. They offered me a really nice 6 months consultancy package, which I should have taken. But I thought, no, I'm going to go and start something else up that's going to be bigger and better. In hindsight, that didn't happen. I should have just taken 6 months to sort of chill out a bit, have a bit of a longer transition period and think about what I wanted to do. So they offered it to me, but I didn't take it.
So 1 month break and back into Founderland, you know.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and Antler's fantastic, by the way. So I would endorse same as Cambridge Social Ventures, Antler, Entrepreneur First. All of these programs are excellent, but it's a very defined period. And a learning for me is if you go from a startup and then jump straight into one of these things, is you have such high expectations on your shoulders. You kind of force ideas. And so I think if I'd taken that 6 months to think about really what I wanted to do next, I would have been in a better position to try and start something else up.
Okay. Right. And Loic, your process, your handover process sounds like it was kind of planned with military precision and went like clockwork, but were there any problems along the way that...
Oh yeah, definitely. We all know you make a plan so that then you know what you're deviating from, right? So I mean, the first one was pandemic, so that already, as I say, that delayed when I intended to activate the plan. Then the first time we tried to recruit for a successor, we weren't successful. We didn't get good enough candidates. And that was a tricky conversation with the board as to what we should do. I think it was easy then to kind of get pushed into kind of panic mode, and to take someone who wasn't right and so on. But we resisted that. I think I agreed to stay on a little bit longer, as in a few months. And we also agreed that my then deputy would step up as interim for a period of a month or two. Because we then found some other candidates, but that had a little bit of a lag to it. So we definitely did that, and it was great to have my deputy be able to do that, and he ended up doing a really good job of that, surprising himself in the process, which was really nice. I think that gave him quite a lot of confidence. So there were, yeah, I think those were probably the key things. I then had a climbing accident and almost died, which slightly got in the way of the handover period. Because we'd agreed that I'd do like a day or two a week, I think it was, for the first 2 months, just to help get through to the next board meeting and so on, which I kind of managed to do, but from a sort of fairly incapacitated state. So that was a bit unexpected. Yeah, so no, things definitely don't necessarily go to plan, but it was really helpful to have a kind of baseline position of what we were trying to work towards and what the basic kind of underpinning principles were for how we were going to go about the process.
That certainly puts things in context. Kath, so after moving on, how did you feel after moving on from BB and Leaf? Was it mourning? Was it excitement? Mixture of both?
I don't think I could pin that down to one feeling. It was certainly a big journey through it, and what was really funny is that I was handling everybody else's grief over it, whereas I didn't feel the same sadness. And I think when you're a founder, I think Loic mentioned it earlier, it can be quite lonely. And so when and it's a long time exiting, and so once you're so focused on this, right, we're going this way, and I had to suddenly change it and go that way, and that's okay. But when I got there, I thought, no, this is right, this is good. And announcing that meant that then everybody else's feelings had to be taken into account. And then when I say everyone else's, I mean customers, thousands of customers had feelings about it. It is amazing how much your venture becomes purposeful for you, and without something else obviously in your vision about what's next. So Alex had his next thing, I didn't have my next thing, and so I did spend a year kind of doing consultancy work for small for SMEs and particularly on strategy and how to engage with their customers, and that helped. And then this opportunity at Form the Future came along, which was great. But I think Anne, who's the founder of Form the Future, had her own concerns about how I would interact with another venture, not being the founder. And she was, she asked me outright, how are you going to deal with that? And it was a really interesting question because I didn't know. I'm very team oriented. I'm very much a people person. I like working in groups rather than individually. And so when I was a founder, I did struggle with that loneliness, but I asked my team a lot. I really involved them with the process of moving the business on. And I think that helped me to be able to move into a role where I was part of an SLT, but not the founder. So I could contribute in, but it wasn't necessarily on my shoulders in the same way. So yeah, there was a big journey of moving on.
And Alex, how have the lessons that you learned from Murthy fed into your present activities?
So I thought that going from being a founder to I've recently, last 3 months, joined WageStream as head of health and social care, the fastest growing social impact business in the world. It's really exciting business. And I thought working for someone that's going to be less stressful, but I am just as stressed. I stress about different things. So I don't stress about paying my team or investors, but I dream about WageStream. I stress about, am I doing a good enough job? So I think it's, sadly, possibly, I think it's down to a founder mentality. And I'm a founder. So nothing's changed in that regard. I mean, I'm getting paid a lot more now, which is great than working for myself. That definitely helps. Otherwise, the kind of the lessons and the learnings that I've taken, curiosity is a big one. There's a massive value at Murthy, and I'm just a curious person, but I kind of try to ingrain that in the team, and I'm taking that forwards in my role here. I also feel that being a business owner and going through hiring, firing, raising capital, leading people, it gives you a level of confidence that you exude. And so moving forwards, I feel like it's helped me, even in my role here. I'm challenging the founders, I'm speaking up, I'm pushing things, and I feel like that those learnings from my time as a founder have helped and will help me moving forwards in everything that I do.
And one final question from me, Loic, have you got any advice relating to to this for social entrepreneurs who are starting the journey, who are at the coalface in maybe their first venture at the moment?
Yeah, I think from that early stage to be thinking, okay, how is this going to work if I'm incapacitated, or if I'm not there? So to think, because it's very easy to kind of put yourself front and center to talk about how you're the founder. I tended to avoid even talking about myself as the founder of the organization, actually, from quite an early stage, because I think the more you kind of build up the sort of myth of a founder and kind of have the organization hanging off you rather than you being the chief executive serving the organization in the public eye, particularly for something that is in the public eye. To me, the more you can remove yourself from that and empower your team, the more easy it will be to step back, I think. So I think and making sure that you're not just the best person there. You know, that you've got a board where you've got people who you admire and respect and who have things that you don't have and are able to operate at a really high level, and who are going to be able who you trust to do the right thing for the organization.
Thanks, Loic. Are there any questions from our other attendees?
While we wait, can I just give a couple of thoughts or advice, if that's okay, on entrepreneurs, everyone here? So make sure you're building a painkiller, not a vitamin. We did it with Murthy. We started off pre-pandemic by, I think I said, taking underutilized space in care homes and connecting it to older adults, which is a real pain. Daycare centers are being closed across the country. There's a lot of underutilized space in care homes. It was a really interesting model. Then the pandemic came, and of course, care homes, retirement homes went into lockdown, and we pivoted to an online model. You kind of pivot, but what we realized was we became more of a nice to have rather than a need to have. And so really focusing on solving real customer problems and making sure that there is a willingness to pay. So painkiller, not a vitamin. Secondly, team beats problem, beats solution. A good team is most important. Then identifying a good problem and then finding a solution for that problem. So team critical. If you're looking for a co-founder, take your time, don't rush it. I kind of rushed it with someone at the beginning. Think about your skills matrix, make sure they complement you. Or could they simply be a great hire? Do they really need to be a co-founder? Mistake I made, I didn't have an agreement in place with my first co-founder. Make sure you have a vesting schedule for shares, because after a few months, we didn't have that in place and it became it was horrible. It really blew up in our faces. And then finally, just is investment right for you? Is VC or investment right for you? It really sets you down a path that's difficult to move away from. Some of the best businesses started as what would be called a lifestyle business, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, and then just grew through profits. Good business. So worth thinking about that. Hopefully they gave you enough time to ask some questions.
Well, there are no questions, but those are really good points. So going with that, Loic, Kath, any final words you'd like to say or pearls of wisdom?
I guess I could just illustrate a couple of Alex's, because obviously very different organizations, you know, not what we were doing was not at all as capital dependent and so on. So yeah, we didn't have investment, but that's because organic growth, it was a perfectly reasonable way to grow a small organization like that doesn't have many costs beyond staffing. Yeah, I mean, if we could have taken a different trajectory, and maybe we could have found investment and done something that was more lucrative and scaled more, but that was not what we set out to do. And I think we did grow from that sort of lifestyle approach. I also didn't get a co-founder. I had a first hire who was my deputy and who was amazing, and we acted to all intents and purposes as co-founders, I guess. But I think I agree that it's quite an onerous decision. I hear people talking about trying to find a co-founder and the dynamics that sets up and so on. And I think it almost seems to have become a sort of received wisdom that you have to have a co-founder, which I don't quite understand. If you're going to employ someone else, then why can't they be a deputy or have, you know, at the moment I've actually agreed to work as a chief research officer for an organization. In effect, I'm kind of helping someone to set something up, but it doesn't, I don't need to be recruited as a co-founder. So I don't think it's the only way forward. So yeah, I guess I'm just kind of agreeing with what Alex is saying there and showing what that can look like.
Thanks, Loic. That's great. Kath, any other pearls of wisdom? Then we'll go to Rachel's question.
Just quickly on, we've talked a lot about moving on, and there's various different ways you can do that, whether it was successful or whether it was not successful. And I think from my point of view, it was kind of derailed because of something out of my control, but it was deemed as not successful as a result. And I think that can be quite hard. So just from the well-being point of view, what I took from founding a business and scaling it, what came out of that, the experience for me and the skill set and what I was able then to take forward was really important focusing on. And I would say to founders who are in their first venture, particularly first venture, is that this may be your only venture, but it also may be one of many. And it's important not to get so hung up on this particular one and accept that there will be other avenues to go down and not just stay on this one. I think that's important just from a well-being perspective.
Rachel, can you unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, of course. Thanks very much. Sorry, it took me a bit of time to formulate, and it is a slightly vague question, but so mostly directed at Kath, but interested in all your thoughts. Is you said you didn't know exactly what you were going to do next, unlike Alex, who was going off to Antler. So how did each of you balance kind of your priorities for your next thing, whether that's the sector, the mission, the role, the skills you wanted to develop? Alex, you kindly shared you wished you had taken the consulting package or taken a bit more time. Yeah, but how do you think about what you're gonna do next? And I guess it's different for everyone, but curious. Your thoughts. Thank you.
I think at the end of the adventure, there is an element of being quite worn out, being quite tired, and there's a period of time where you perhaps need to reset and not be so hung up. If you don't know, and you can afford not to have to just rush straight into something, just take the time to let everything settle, which I did do, and I was very lucky to be able to do that for a few months. And if you can't, try and just do something in the meantime to keep everything running. And like I said about coming out of a venture with experience and different skill sets to how you went in, that's really important to focus in on. And coming back to why you went into that venture and the values that you went in with, are they the same? Are they, for me, it very much was the same. I always want to work in business that does good. I want to work in social ventures or the charity sector, and to always be pushing forward and innovating and thinking how can we make this better for people? And it was important for me to be able to stay in that space and for the next opportunity to resonate deeply with me. But my one takeaway is, if you can afford not to rush it, then don't panic about it. Make a decision quickly.
Yeah. So from my perspective, I took some time to reflect whilst we were going through the kind of acquisition process in December 2022 of what were my key learnings from Murthy. Did I have any other ideas? What problem areas really interested me? I put together a personal budget. So what can I actually afford? Can I afford to not have a salary, and for how long? And then what was really important was to speak to my wife about how she feels, because she'd gone through some really tough times. It was tough for me. It was very tough for her. No holidays, being stressed with me, and she was not keen on me doing another startup. But I managed to say that this is where my passion is. Here's what I can do to provide over X time period. I want to give myself 6 months, is what I said, and to start something else up. Here are sort of the areas that I'm passionate about. In order to get somewhere in that 6 months, I'm going to join one of these accelerators, because they accelerate you through. There's a defined point at which you can get investment or not, and we agreed that kind of she would support me through that. And so that was kind of what went through my head at the end of that 6 months, which actually went to 9 months. I then said, okay, fine, I'll get a job. And I was fortunate enough to get one relatively quickly.
Loic, were you going to say something?
I can jump in. Yeah, I mean, for me, the guiding point was I definitely did want some space. I wanted to reflect on what I'd learned. I think in a way, in order to capitalize on everything I'd learned over a decade, I needed to actually spend some time doing that. But I also know that, probably like most people who become founders, it's very hard not to jump on something and not to have a sense of something. So I kind of found a way of marrying the two. I decided I'd write a book, and that gave me so that's what I'm doing now, and that gave me something that felt that is purposeful, but also kind kind of flexible and gives me space to learn. And the amount I've learned by now, looking back at all my work in policy and thinking about what that teaches me about policy and what I can write about that, and it has been huge. And then I felt fairly confident that I was used to bringing in kind of, in effect, freelance work and consultancy work, because that's kind of what I'd done for years. So I felt fairly relaxed about the fact that I could find work. I actually did get asked, as I think often happens when Alex was asked to do that consultancy package and so on. I think it's often the case that once people know that you're leaving, they start approaching you to do bits and bobs. So by the time I left, I think I'd already got a kind of regular commitment of a couple of days of consultancy a month and so on. So that made it all a bit less nerve-wracking. I knew that I'd then be able to pull some other bits in, and I had the book to work on. So that meant that I didn't have to jump into anything, that I could take the time to think and learn without it being too scary.
Okay, so I'm going to wrap up at this point. We're reaching the hour mark. I want to thank our fantastic panelists, Kath, Alex and Loic. It's been a really brilliant session. I want to thank the attendees and also Pam Mungru for setting this all up. As I mentioned, this is one of a series of social venturing conversations. This is the third. So there will be another one along in probably 2 or 3 months' time. So watch our social media if you're interested, and come along and listen to the next one. And once again, thanks everybody.